Hello, everyone, and welcome to Iterator. My name is Richard Ferreira, and I'm here with Shaurya and we're going to chat about the interview that we just had with Dr. Margaret Dalziel. I think we can kick it off. Shaurya, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Richard. I had a very relaxing weekend after getting my booster shot. What about you?
Exciting. I watched Boardwalk Empire, and I had a lot of fun.
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So tell me about the chat that you had with Dr. Dalziel. What were the key insights that you got from that interview?
Oh, so Margaret is my professor of business strategy and business model validation in the University of Waterloo. I'm a grad student there. And when we had a conversation about why startups fail, the key takeaways I realized was that startups fail due to founders' commitment issues. It can be the differences in the changes in the team, the expectations, or failure in fundraising. There's a lot of key takeaways which I had, but the overarching theme I thought was lack of experimentation from the founders' end, and giving up after said failed experiments. The founders just thinking the idea is not going to work. What about you?
Interesting. It's funny that you mention the founders doing experiments and thinking that they're not going to work, because then it depends on what they actually defined as success in the first place, right? Because then perhaps you can expand a little bit on it. You could shoot for the moon, but you could also have a very respectable small startup in which you're earning a living and you have like modest expectations. What would you say about that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And to think of it, those two are totally different categories of entrepreneurs. The first one we're talking about are like all guns blazing, 100% in the journey kind of entrepreneurs who only care about the idea. The ones we see on social media or in movies, they are obsessed with the idea or the problem. They are trying their best. They are sacrificing it all to reach the solution or the conclusion of their vision. Whereas the second category is more of a lifestyle entrepreneur where they may have a steady job, they may have a set of expectations from their families, etc., but they still want to be financially independent and they just do the thing as a side gig. Those two are totally different classes of entrepreneurs and they have very different journeys. And from what I can tell from experience, both of them have different definitions of failure. For example, an entrepreneur who is all guns blazing, I wouldn't say that an entrepreneur would consider his startup as a failed startup ever. It's more of a learning experience for them or like a failed experiment for them, which taught them something which they didn't know, which they can use and use in their next startup or their next entrepreneurial journey. Whereas for a lifestyle entrepreneur, it's more like they failed in their idea, they probably give up. They probably will ensure that whatever capital they lost in the process, they wait till they gain it back from their main gig and then probably start again depending on their capacity.
It's very interesting that you split into those two because you've got those two kind of categories. But now it reminded me of other two categories that might intersect with those two as well, because I was reading Disciplined Entrepreneurship, and which is a great book, and it talks about small and medium enterprises. Essentially, you think your bakeries, your butcher shops, or even others. There are many in that category, and then your idea-driven enterprises, which is what we kind of expect when we think about startups, especially in the technology space. Startups that are trying to do something new, that are trying to meet an unmet market need. So let's say, for example, Facebook, it discovered a need that, was it there already? Because you could say that Facebook kind of went and substituted Friendster and then maybe High Five or any other products at the time. But thinking about those two as well, a bakery owner wouldn't really expect to have a multi-million-dollar exit, right? Sure. Mostly because, the process is very well defined. They know that they need to get the materials, make the bread, for example, and then sell it, right? And they're working with the margins. They know what their costs are going to be. But for an idea-driven enterprise, it's different, right? Especially if you talk about software as a service, in which you expect to put in a lot of money into it, put in a lot of effort, not see results just yet, but just experiment along the way and see what you can find. And all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, but hopefully you start getting traction, and perhaps you start showing a little bit in terms of revenue, right? And then you try and multiply and expand. So that's what I thought about there as well.
Yeah, and to think about it, even their definitions of success and failure would be very different. Like their key metrics for success or key metrics for growth will be very different compared to, I mean, comparing Facebook with a grocery store or a bakery. Those are very different businesses, and as you said, like the scalability strategies or scalability, the reality of scalabilities would be very different. You cannot have a bakery or a chain of bakery that is going to be as big as Facebook, and those people who are running the bakery, they know it. So it's more about the entrepreneur's expectations from the business as well, which matters in this case. A person who wants to make it big, they know they wouldn't make the cut by running a small store. They have to go big or go home. So, and I think that leads to another reason as to why there are a few entrepreneurs who are so obsessed with the idea of entrepreneurship, because they know that it's a one-way ticket. If they make it, they make it. And no other career can give them that amount of success or that amount of accolades or money even. And whereas the people who are running that bakery or a small enterprise or a small startup, they realize that they are not going to reach that level of probably financial freedom. They will have financial freedom, but it won't be a multi-million exit to an acquisition or a merger even. So it sets the tone for the context of success and failure as well. And I think that's something which Margaret beautifully touched, that every context or every industry or every startup's definition of success or failure is very different. And it also depends on the type of experiments they conduct to determine that.
Yeah. Now I'm trying to think about, I know that Dr. Dalziel mentioned user interviews. And that reminds me of a quote by Michael Seibel. I think he was the head of YC, Y Combinator. And he mentioned that the two most important things that a startup can do is build and talk to users, mostly because building is essentially the value that you're trying to bring into the world, right? And by talking to users, you just make sure that you're building the right thing, right? Because I've seen folks that focus a lot on the feasibility of things, right? Hey, can this work? Can we make this technological breakthrough do something, right? But they sometimes don't dedicate enough resources to the desirability aspect of it. As in, do people want it? Are we addressing a user need? Are we addressing either a pain point? Are we giving anything to the user, right? Are we helping them achieve a job to be done? And so I think that that's very meaningful in terms of knowing the types of experiments that you can run, because a user interview can be considered a type of experiment. Depending on the type of, if you've got a discussion guide there, right? If you're having the interview with a prototype or without one, you can get different kinds of evidence there. And also you've got concierge experiments, Wizard of Oz experiments. You've got a whole universe of things that you can just dive in and figure out the evidence that you're going to get and use that for your next step.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. And I agree with the desirability aspect. There's another hidden aspect which many entrepreneurs or startups fail to address. That's the adaptability. A few people are so obsessed with their idea that even though those said experiments, they say that this is not a feasible idea or this is not a feasible market, people still go ahead with it and they crash and burn. A good example of adaptability will be the Nokia devices. When Nokia phones were first released, they were built for lumberjacks to communicate with each other, and it was a very small, a niche market. But then they realized that there is a bigger market at play, that is the layman. People can use mobile phones irrespective of them working in any industry. It's just such a terrific use case that everyone should be using that. If the founder had probably not thought about it, we would probably not be having mobile phones with us right now. So adaptability, and that also brings home the fact that conducting those experiments is so important. The founder probably wouldn't have realized this use case had he not conducted experiments or had he not conducted probably the user interviews. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. It's it reminds me of, I believe it was the CEO of Segment, I think so, in which they I think they had a product in market, they were doing one thing, and then there was an experiment on the side that started yielding results. And the CEO decided to think, okay, I'm going to try and kill this experiment. I don't want this idea coming anywhere near me. And the more resources that he started throwing at it, the idea just persisted, right? And it just resisted everything. It was just obdurate like that. And so eventually it grew to such a size that now I think it became one of the main pillars of what the company actually does. And I think that's fantastic, because being able to bob and weave with that, just find what users are actually struggling with and addressing that. An idea is, ideas should be strongly held. No, what's the expression? Now I'm forgetting. But it's more believing in the idea wholeheartedly, but being open to other inputs that might be able to steer where you go next.
Yeah, interesting view. There's another thing that we probably need to clarify is a customer's needs and a customer's wants. Many a times, people, while conducting surveys or conducting interviews or just trying to validate their idea, they ask the wrong questions to the customers, which leads to wrong conclusions and wrong results from their experiment in general. And it's just a waste of resources and time for everyone. For example, whenever you're conducting like an interview or a survey, never ask what the user wants. It's more about finding the pain points of the users and finding out indirectly if what they are building, the founders, is it going to address that pain point, or is that a recurring theme that they are getting from their surveys or from their results? Because in my grad school, we conducted a lot of surveys and interviews, and this was the first thing that was drilled down in our heads. Never trust the user's wants from a product. It's going to be very different. And there is a difference between a user who will say, yes, if there's this product exists, I will buy it, versus shut up and take my money. Those two are very different kind of customers. And you would want to tackle or go after the latter.
I know that in terms, the example that's often given is that consumers don't want a drill bit. They want a hole in the wall, right? And you could actually go up a step, because you might ask yourself, okay, but what does a hole in the wall do, right? Why would a consumer actually want that? You could go up to the level of saying, okay, maybe they want to put up a painting, right? They want to make their home beautiful. And that's essentially what their job to be done is one of the reasons that I really like that framework is that it asks, what do users actually want to do, right? And it doesn't really matter how they go about doing it, because let's say, for example, they could be currently using a substitute. They might be feeling that pain point so severely that they want to adapt different things and be ingenious in that sense to try and address that point. And so being eagle-eyed and being able to say, okay, this is what the customers are trying to do. Let's see if there's an easier way about it, and being flexible in the execution and the way that you get about it, but passionate about solving the user problem.
Yeah, that's very true. And another topic that comes up with this is the entrepreneur's timeline for pushing out the product. Depending on the results they get from the said experiments, it can also indicate the urgency of the problem to be solved. There can be an overwhelmingly positive response about or overwhelmingly positive outcome of the experiment, which shows that majority of the people are facing the issue, and they should probably, instead of perfecting their product, they should just release it right away and get user feedback on the same, rather than waiting for 6-7 months to polish it further and then get user feedback. So what's your take on that? Like the iterations of each product, when do you think would be the right time for a first-time entrepreneur to publish their product, or just throw it in the market and get feedback and then keep on improving it?
100%. I feel very strongly about it. So strongly that it's one of the main reasons that the podcast is called The Iterator. The other reason is that I wanted to get away from pivot, because many people think that, oh yeah, the pivot, that's the big thing. But the major differences that are made are in the small incremental steps that you make towards the goal, right? But now that you mention that, I think that no idea survives first contact with reality, right? So my philosophy is that you build as little as you possibly can, but not less. And then you put that into users' hands. And that's going to teach you a lot more than, let's say, for example, if you spend a lot more time building it. And so, for example, you're building something that has three features, ABC. You get ABC into users' hands, and maybe they say, I don't know, I don't really want to use C. And B actually offends me as a human being, just an example. While you could have gotten away with just building A, taking it into their hands, and they could say, oh yeah, what would be nice? I would want to do something, I would want to do this plus something else. And that gives you the idea to build feature D that wasn't even on the radar. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's wonderfully said. And again, this comes from your experience as a venture destroyer or a venture killer, as you call yourself. Again, what do you think would be the main reasons from your experience that a venture dies? Even though they probably pivot, they put in the capital, they put in the efforts, sometimes things just don't work out.
Yeah, true. Oh, by the way, just a note on the venture killer glib. It's mostly because in my early days as a product manager, and look at me, early days, barely a year into the role, but I was focused a lot more on venture validation, right? And my objective there was to run experiments to just make sure that ideas were working. And I found that it was very valuable to essentially take the opposite stance and say, okay, formulate some hypotheses, like, okay, we believe that this is going to happen, to know that we'll know that we have succeeded if something else happens, right? And I started thinking about, okay, what if I actively try to see if they can survive these experiments, not rooting for them, but maybe saying that rooting against them was a little bit too harsh, but just being taking a step back and being a little bit more analytical about the ideas, no matter how much I like them or no matter how much I didn't like them, whatever it might be. And so, yeah, that's where the glib comment of Richard Killer came through. But yeah, it's when you mention about ideas not working out, I know that the founders' capabilities, the founders, the way that they work with each other, dedication, that's a big aspect. But I would say that focusing too much on feasibility, right? Thinking, okay, we can try and build this out as much as we can with all of the features, and the basic assumption there that's not tested. And those pernicious assumptions are very dangerous, right? The basic assumption there is that they would be the perfect customer, which, even if they were, assuming that they were, sometimes they might be a little bit too feature focused instead of jobs to be done focused. So there are two mismatches that could happen there. But if that happens, if they build too much, then they run out of runway, then they're not testing the right thing. That's one of the reasons that I've seen that things just don't end up working out. And it's surprising how many people think that, okay, we want to have something perfect, right? Right off the bat, we want this to be perfect, no bugs. It addresses 3 different jobs to be done by 3 different customer segments all at once. But they don't quite grasp that apps just, well, not apps, but just businesses in general, they start out very, very small. They start out by testing the bare minimum. Like, let's say, for example, Clubhouse. When Clubhouse launched, and it took me a while for me to get an invite, but when I finally got on it, it was still incredibly buggy. Yeah. The servers crashed all the time. I would join rooms and there would be overflow rooms because they reached the capacity. And there was a lot that Clubhouse was doing that was fantastic, and people kept tuning in because they saw the value of the community that it kind of built. And of course, there's the aspect of the COVID pandemic coming in and people kind of grasping for that community. Correct. But many didn't realize of how much Clubhouse could have said, no, we want to build more and then deliver it to users instead of just launching with what they did. Or
even Airbnb or Reddit for that matter, like coming to internet-based startups. Reddit doesn't have a very sophisticated user interface. It's literally the bare bones features. and the user interface is as good as it was when the day it launched, it with minor changes. And of course, it's less buggy now, but when they launched it, it was of course full of bugs. And the fact that it's still a very text heavy channel or a text heavy source for media shows that even though, let's say you're in 2022, you're still not working on, let's say, NFTs, crypto, or any blockchain based technologies, there are going to be ideas, or there are going to be specific markets who will cater to old technologies, as we call it, or web 2.0 technologies. It's still a very conducive market from what I've gauged over the past few weeks, because as a venture fellow, or as working at the student venture fund, or even working as a private equity analyst in my past life before joining grad school, I saw that with an uptick in specific trends across the world, we see an increase in number of ventures. And I see that as a pitfall, because people get obsessed with a specific set of technologies. They don't get obsessed with the problem. So another of my profs, he always says, get obsessed with the problem, not with the technology or the solution. Because sometimes what you think is the ideal solution, it is not an ideal solution. You are thinking just like a client or a customer who thinks it is an ideal solution. It's your duty as an entrepreneur to validate the problem rather than the solution. Come up with viable solutions, test those out, and then zero down on one solution that works, and then build upon it.
I couldn't agree more. Especially in having multiple solutions and multiple options of solving the problem. It makes a tremendous difference. And I think it's something that's very much underrated with folks when they start in their new ventures and they start going on these adventures.
Yeah, true. So what's your observation been all this while working at Delta, when it comes to startups, or the entrepreneur psychology, or from whatever you've seen, what's probably one or two common things that you've seen in the successful startups that have come out from Delta?
Yeah. I think that especially when it comes to the founders, I think it goes without saying that one of the best traits that founders can have is just very, there we go, that's the expression that I forgot, strongly held opinions, strong opinions held loosely, right? And I think that many people are very, very much capable of having those very strong opinions. They think that this should be in this way, and they believe in this vision of the future that they're trying to bring into the present by sheer force of will and hard work, which is very admirable. I love that about founders. But one thing that sometimes they don't pay as much attention to is being able to look at the data and believe what the data is telling them. Of course, there's a whole conversation on actually getting the right data, making sure that the data is accurate, making sure that wild goose chases are avoided, right? But when the data, kind of like informs, when you let the data inform your direction, that's a good space to be. And it's very good for founders to be open-minded in that way. There is, because as I found, the founders that are most flexible and most adaptable are the ones that can keep that open mind and go forward like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. So in AI or ML, your algorithm or your product is only as good as the data you feed it. And that's true for even idea or business model validation in general. It's only going to be as good as the questions or as the experiments you use to validate the said idea. Yeah.
It's the first time that I learned about that. The first time that I really felt it in my bones is when I was studying engineering. I did this course called computational fluid dynamics, and in a past life, I kind of was thinking of doing a postgrad in that. The complex math kind of disabused me of that notion very quickly, but it was a great class to take. And essentially, for those not aware, computational fluid dynamics, or CFD as it's more widely known, is essentially just modeling fluid flow, right? So imagine if a plane is taking off, just modeling how that air is going to behave as it goes around the wing tip. And that's why the angle of attack is so important, because it can create lift, and it's beautiful. But the important thing is that from in that context, you get the physics, and you can't really put the physics straight into code. So in that context, you use something called discretization, so an approximation. And by doing that, you still have to make assumptions. The assumptions that you make, if those assumptions are not right, your code is not going to be right. The output is not going to be right. Mm-hmm. I know that a former prof of mine, he used to say garbage in, garbage out. Mm-hmm. So being very, very mindful and deliberate in the way that you approach those problems, it's critical. I agree.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's so amazing that however complex we think the journey of an entrepreneur is, we can still draw parallels from simple processes like writing a code or doing like data training of an AI-based algorithm. I know I'm saying simple and AI, it may be intimidating or not too intuitive, but for those who have a background in computer science or know decently about how AI works, they would probably appreciate this analogy a bit more than the others.
Yeah, I agree. It's fascinating how we think about these complex subjects and the lessons that we can learn from them and apply it to other places. Mm-hmm. Because the nature of what is the word that I'm looking for? I forget, but it's going from subject to subject and taking teachings from one to another. There's a lot more overlap than we expect.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. And was there anything else from the chat that you'd want to mention as well?
Another thing I probably wanted to touch upon was from Margaret's experience herself. Her experience lies in non-tech based startups. And from when I draw parallels from my experience analyzing tech-based startups, the key factors for success are very different. So another thing to keep in mind for an entrepreneur is to study the industry properly, because what is considered a good amount of growth in one space may not be the case in the second. So again, that is the entrepreneur's duty to study the industry, how the market is. So there's a very popular strategy or called blue ocean strategy. So that's another thing which people should keep in mind while before starting their ventures. Are they entering a market that's already crowded or whose market share has been already taken by the big players such as the Googles, the Apples of the world? Or are they entering a totally new, brand spanking new industry where we have negligible competitors? The chances of success lie in the blue ocean strategy in terms of the industries or the spaces where there's less number of competitors. You have a higher chance of success because you'll be able to capture the market easily. And another thing which I was thinking about that is if you enter a red market or a market that's crowded, if you're doing something differently from others, there is still a chance of success. Again, my definition of success in a red ocean would be probably an acquisition by the said giant. And that can be profitable or a desirable outcome for many entrepreneurs because that's a successful exit, right? So that's something I wanted to touch upon too.
It's very interesting that you bring that up as well, because studying the market is there's so many market forces that if a startup founder isn't conscious of them, that essentially they can sweep them away, right? And I know that one of the most fantastic things is when founders kind of have the foresight to see that, okay, this product is so niche that it can either create a new marketplace or it can well, I suppose you can create a new marketplace at the intersection of two existing ones, right? And so that would essentially put them a little bit more out of reach from the incumbents. Mm-hmm. So even if, let's say, for example, you got two markets, they're very, very hotly contested. Someone comes in and they have the agility, they have the foresight that the juggernauts don't really have the time for. And they see that, okay, at this sliver, this intersection, there's enough of a market there to make a venture worthwhile. And if they chase it, they go full steam ahead with it faster than the juggernauts can catch on. They can essentially capture that, right, as a beachhead. and they could expand it more and more, so that essentially, you know, they increase that market size, and it's something that's beautiful. You know, maybe I'm getting too sentimental about it.
Yeah. Well, I guess that was a super interesting discussion about why startups fail, what are the key factors of success and failures, the definition of success and failure themselves, what an entrepreneur can do to avoid the said failure in terms of performing the wrong experiments or using the wrong questions while asking to customers. I think it was a pretty comprehensive discussion we had for like this follow-up podcast to Dr. Margaret Dalziel's interview.
Yeah, I had a tremendous amount of fun. Looking forward to the next ones.
Oh yeah, me too.
Awesome. Right. So are you happy if we wrap it up here?
Yeah, sure.
Fantastic. Right. Then to all the listeners, thank you so much for sticking around. This has been Iterator. My name is Richard. I was here with Shaurya. And yeah, you can catch us on YouTube or anywhere else where you catch your podcasts. Right. Cheers, and I'll see you in the next one.
Cheers.